Hey y'all, it's Dawn, and I'm so glad you're back. I've got another fun, budget-friendly DIY video for you today. I used a Dollar Tree Christmas ball and some chenille yarn. Starting at the top of the ornament, I placed a bead of hot glue and placed the yarn in it. I wrapped the entire ball with the yarn. I attached the head to the bed spring with 2 zip ties and hot glue. I'm not sure what happened with the footage, but all I did was place 2 zip ties into the hole where you would hang the ornament from. After, I pulled the zip ties tight and added hot glue and held the head in place until the hot glue had time to set up. I used various buttons from my stash for the eyes and the mouth of the snowman and hot glued them into place. I used an orange Dollar Tree bead for the nose and hot glued it. For his hat, I used this fabric I got from Walmart and glued some of the yarn around the edge with hot glue. I wrapped the fabric around and glued it down the seam. I tried to line up all the lines so it would have an even appearance. I gathered the top of the hat and placed a rubber band. After putting the hat on his head, he still needed something. So I decided to make a simple bow for him using this ribbon. And attached it under his head with hot glue. I also added 3 buttons to the spring. His hat still needed something else. It took me a couple of tries to figure out what he was missing, but what I did was add a couple of bells and some greenery to the end of his hat. And just look at how stinking cute he turned out. I felt sorry for him because he didn't have a friend, so I decided to make him a girlfriend. I had another bed spring and a piece of fabric from Walmart. I used the fabric to create a dress for the snow woman. After I cut the fabric to size, I used hot glue to attach it to the bed spring. I attached her head like I did with his with zip ties and hot glue. I used a zip tie, placed it through the top of the ball, wrapped it around the top of the spring, and pulled it tight. Attaching the head was the hardest part of this project. I just had to make sure I held everything in place until the hot glue had time to set up. I used more buttons and hot glue for her face. I made a crown for her using a Dollar Tree berry garland. She turned out so stinking cute too. I think both of the snow people are so stinking cute for this winter and Christmas season. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you'd like to try this project and don't have any bed springs, check out my online store. I'll leave a link in the description. I have a box full of old bed springs that I removed from an old box spring back in the spring. I decided to try to make a small Christmas tree out of one of these. I used a 20 gauge jewelry wire to attach some jingle bells to the tree. I cut the wire long enough so I could wrap it around the bed spring a couple of times to hold the jingle bells on, and used a pair of pliers to secure them. I placed the jingle bells sporadically around the bed spring. When I was finished attaching the jingle bells, I thought it needed something else. I had some Dollar Tree berry garland and wrapped it around the bed spring. Now it's starting to look more like what I have in mind. I had a few of these old rusty stars in my stash and thought they would be cute at the top of the tree. I glued 2 of the stars together with hot glue and then lightly brushed over the star with Waverly white chalk paint. And attached the star by wrapping some of the berry garland around it. I also added a string of Dollar Tree lights to give a little something extra to my tree. I love how this bed spring Christmas tree turned out. Let me know what you think in the comments. What do you do with a rusty bed spring and a Dollar Tree bell? You make a large jingle bell. As you know, I have a ton of these bed springs, and I found this large Dollar Tree bell in my stash from last year. The bell was shiny, so I painted it with Waverly white chalk paint to get rid of the shine. And then decided to add a little white paint to the bed spring too. This is so they would match and look like they actually went together. I did a fairly messy paint job on the bed spring. I still wanted it to look rustic and farmhouse. And since the bed spring had some rust showing, I used folk art burnt umber to rust up the bell. I used a piece of twine to attach the bell to the bed spring. I bunched up some of this ribbon I got from Hobby Lobby and placed a zip tie in the middle to create a bow. I used more of the ribbon to create tails for the bow. I wasn't really worried about how the center of the bow looked because I'm going to attach various Christmas greenery, berries, and a pine cone to the center of the bow. I hot glued everything into place. and then hot glued the bow onto the jingle bell. I attached another piece of twine to the top of the bed spring so the jingle bell could be hung up. This project actually turned out better than I was expecting. It's so rustic and farmhouse. I just love it. I think it is so stinking cute. If you want to try this project for yourself and you don't have any bed springs, you'll find a link in the description where you can go and purchase some. Let me know in the comments if you'll be trying this Jingle Bell DIY for yourself. I had these little scrap wood pieces in my stash and thought they would make a cute little book stack for a tier tray. I painted one with Waverly ink chalk paint and the other two with Waverly white chalk paint. But hey, I'm not going to bore you with all the painting. I stacked the books on top of each other, but I didn't glue them together. I did this so if I wanted to change them up or add other mini wood books, I could. I placed a dab of hot glue and added the end of this ribbon to it. I wrapped the ribbon around the books and glued the other end. I had this little stem from another project. I cut it down so it would lay just a little bit flatter on the books. I added some little berries to it also. Added another dab of hot glue and added the little embellishment on top of the ribbon. Instead of cutting out vinyl, I decided to use these little stamps for the book spines. And these turned out so stinking sweet. Let me know in the comments what you think. I found these cute little wood tags on Amazon and knew I had to make some little gift tags or ornaments. I painted the front of the tags with folk art pearl white metallic paint. You can't really tell with the camera, but it has a little shimmer to it. It did take a couple of coats to cover up the wood grain on the tags. On the back, I used Waverly ink chalk paint. After the tags dried, I applied this reusable buffalo print transfer from Amazon to the back of the tags and used Chalk Couture Shimmer Frost. I applied a thick layer to start and then removed the excess and placed it back in the jar. I removed the transfer and dried the tags with my heat gun. I flipped the tags over and used a different part of the transfer for the front side. After I applied the transfer to the tags, I used Chalk Couture black velvet chalk paste to create the buffalo checks. I'll leave a link in the description to my Amazon store where you can pick up this buffalo plaid transfer if you want. It's a reusable mesh transfer and it works great. I purchased it because the only buffalo print Chalk Couture has are 18 by 18 inches, and I do more small projects. So this smaller transfer works better for me. I also found these beads on Amazon, and I'll leave them in my store too. They were already painted, so that was a plus. I placed a piece of tape on some twine and began stringing the beads, just like I would if I was making a garland. I added all the beads in the order I wanted them, so I wouldn't have to keep reapplying the tape. I tied the first tag onto the twine, slid the beads, and cut the twine, leaving enough room to create a loop at the top, and used hot glue to hold the loop. I made a tiny bow with this Hobby Lobby ribbon and glued it to cover the end of the loop. I did the same process with the rest of the little tags. These little tags can be used as Christmas tree ornaments or as tags for gifts. I think they turned out so stinking cute. And just look at how cute they are on this mini Christmas tree. Let me know how you would use these tags in the comments below. I painted this piece of wood from Dollar Tree with folk art white chalk paint, and of course dried it with my heat gun. After the paint was dry, I added a layer of Chalk Couture surface wax to the front and buffed it out. I wanted to use this Chalk Couture transfer, but it was too big for the piece of wood I was using. So I decided to rearrange it a little. I placed the end of the transfer towards the end of the wood and taped off the parts I didn't want to get paste on with painter's tape. I then applied a layer of Chalk Couture black velvet paste over the part of the transfer I had just taped off and removed the excess, placing it back into the jar. I removed the transfer and dried the paste with my heat gun. I reapplied the transfer, angling the other part of the transfer, taped it off, and applied more of the paste. When I removed the transfer, I thought it still needed something. I made a little bow out of some Hobby Lobby ribbon. I removed the red berries from this little stem and cut them apart. I glued the berries and the bow to the little sign. Now I just needed a way for the sign to stand up on my tier tray. I found this little easel in my stash and decided to paint it with Waverly ink chalk paint to match my black and white theme. And it worked perfect. Now this little tier tray sign sits high enough that it can be seen. Let me know what you think in the comments. I found these adorable wood houses at Target and thought they would make cute tier tray houses for Christmas. I painted the first house with folk art white chalk paint. And the second house with Waverly ink. I used part of a chalk couture buffalo plaid transfer on the black house and bright white paste. I applied a thick layer of paste to the transfer. On the white house, I used a buffalo plaid transfer I got from Amazon and black velvet chalk paste. I removed the excess paste from the black house and removed the transfer. I then removed the excess paste from the white house and removed the transfer. I absolutely love the way these wooden houses turned out. I placed these little berries onto a little wreath I got from Hobby Lobby. For the other wreath, I used this greenery I found in my stash, shaped it into a small circle, and applied the same berry. I wanted to make the wreaths removable, so I used this Velcro from Dollar Tree. I cut the Velcro in half, applied it to the house, added a little hot glue to the side facing the wreath, and then attached the wreath. This way I can change out the wreaths for other embellishments depending on the season. I then hot glued the bows onto the wreaths. I think these houses turned out so stinking cute. And my favorite part is the removable wreaths. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on these cute little tier tray wood houses. I've had this little Dollar General tag in my stash for a while now. I removed the twine hanger from the top of the tag. I painted the front of the tag with Waverly ink chalk paint and of course dried it with my heat gun. I removed the sticker from the back and painted it with folk art pearl white metallic paint and dried it with my heat gun. On the white side of the tag, I applied a layer of chalk couture surface wax. Used a chalk couture buffalo plaid transfer and black velvet paste. I love this transfer, but as you can see, I had to cut it down. It was a large 18-inch transfer, and I needed something smaller, so I cut it down for my needs. I did the same thing on the black side of the tag, except I used a smaller transfer that I got from Amazon. You'll find a link in the description to my Amazon store where you will find all the products I use from Amazon, including this transfer. I also got a pack of wooden gnomes from Amazon. I painted a couple of the gnomes to add to both sides of the tag. I decided to give his beard a little dimension by adding Dollar Tree white 3D paint. I let the 3D paint dry overnight. The next morning I attached both the gnomes to the wood tag with hot glue. And just look at how stinking cute it is. Let me know in the comments what you would do different. I got this Snowflake recently at Goodwill for I think it was $1.99. I used this chalk couture transfer, which as you can see has been used often. I lined the transfer the way I wanted on the Snowflake and pressed it down with my hands and a roller. I applied a generous amount of chalk couture black velvet chalk paste with a mini squeegee. And then remove the excess paste and put it back into the jar. I removed the transfer and couldn't believe how amazing the star turned out. I dried the chalk paste with my heat gun. And just look at how stinking cute and farmhouse this plain white star is now. Let me know how you would decorate this adorable wood snowflake in the comments below. I found this old Christmas wreath at Goodwill and thought it needed an update. I started by removing everything from the wreath and setting it to the side. I'll hang on to all these little pieces in case I need it for something else or another project. The hardest part was getting all the old hot glue off, and it did take me a while to get it all off. I dry brushed folk art white chalk paint onto the wreath with a chippy brush. I made sure I got the outside and the inside edges also. I did use the little welcome sign from the original wreath, and I painted it with Waverly ink chalk paint. I decided to use this chalk couture transfer on the sign, but it wouldn't fit the way it was laid out on the transfer, so I improvised. After applying chalk couture surface wax and buffing it out, I applied the transfer to the fuzzing mat to remove some of the stickiness. I placed part of the transfer onto the sign and used tape to mask the part of the transfer I didn't want to use. I used chalk couture bright white paste, applied it, removed the excess, and then removed the transfer. I placed the backer on the part of the transfer I had just used and wiped the transfer with a paper towel to remove some of the leftover chalk. I applied the transfer to the other side of the sign and chalked the word Merry. Before moving on to the next step, I used my heat gun to dry the chalk paste I had just applied. Since I had a good bit of room between the words, I decided to place one of the Christmas trees in the center. I used Chalk Couture Shimmer Spruce on the tree. I wrapped the wreath with a Dollar Tree berry garland and attached the sign to the top. At first, I attached some ribbon to the top so the wreath could be hung. But I did decide to remove the ribbon from the top because I'm going to use this on my black and white Christmas tier tray. This little wreath is so stinking cute. And of course, I love the black and white color scheme. Let me know in the comments what you think. If you're interested in the transfer I used for this project, I'll leave a link in the description to my Chalk Couture site. I picked up several embroidery hoops at Goodwill recently and decided with this large one I would make a wreath. The first thing I did was paint the outside hoop with folk art white chalk paint. I placed an old Cricut mat under a Hobby Lobby bandana, applied the Chalk Couture transfer, and taped around the words Merry Christmas. I used Chalk Couture ink and applied it to the transfer. I removed the transfer to reveal the design. I placed the design between two pieces of parchment paper and pressed it with my iron set on high for about 4 minutes. The heat is how the ink is set. By using the ink, I will be able to wash it without worrying about the design coming off. And I don't have to worry about it getting wet when it's hanging on my door. I placed the embroidery hoop onto the bandana and centered the design. I traced around the outside edge of the hoop and then cut the circle out. I placed the bandana onto the top side of the hoop and glued it down tight. I replaced the outside hoop and tightened it. I made a bow using various ribbons and attached it to the top with hot glue. I added a couple of lamb's ear stems and some Dollar Tree berry garland around the bow. And wow, just look at how stinking cute this Merry Christmas door hanger turned out. And it was actually easy to make. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I had this little Christmas tree in my stash and thought it would be perfect on the end of a Christmas garland. I used some scrapbook paper from Hobby Lobby and glued it to the tree, and then used a finger sander and removed the paper from the edge by sanding in a downward motion. Because of the indentions in the tree, it was a little tricky to get all the paper off. And as you can see, some of the paper ripped, but I was able to reattach it. I think this happened because I didn't let the glue dry enough before trying to sand. I had these little black and buffalo check wood beads I got from Amazon, and these larger white beads I got from Hobby Lobby. I decided on a pattern and strung all the beads together. I placed a piece of tape at the end of the twine to make it easier to put it through the beads. I applied Mod Podge to the tree to help protect the paper and placed the twine through the hole in the top of the tree. I then tied a knot to hold it onto the garland. For the tassel at the other end of the garland, I trimmed the wire off of this Hobby Lobby ribbon, cut it into strips, and then cut it in half because I thought it was too long, but that was just a personal choice. You can make the tassel and the garland both as long or as short as you want. I also used some of this Dollar Tree ribbon and some of the twine I used to string the garland. I assembled the tassel and tied it together with a piece of twine. I attached the tassel to the garland by hot gluing the twine from the garland to the tassel, and then wrapping it around the top of the tassel a few times, and adding a little bit more hot glue. Tassels are really easy to make once you figure the tricks out. This garland will go perfect with my black and white Christmas tiara tray this year. Let me know what you think in the comments. For this DIY, I used 2 pieces of scrap wood that were actually the perfect size for a tiara tray stack book. When I make these little book stacks, the length I like to use is 5 inches, but you can use whatever size you want. I painted one of the books with Waverly white chalk paint, and the other I used Waverly crimson chalk paint. I painted all sides of both because I wasn't sure how I wanted to stack them yet. After they were both painted, I used my heat gun to dry them. I created the cut file using Design Space. I'll leave a link in the description for any Cricut users that would like to use it. After cutting and weeding, I applied the vinyl to some transfer paper and applied the sayings to the books. I decided to put North Pole on the top book, and candy canes on the bottom. For some reason, the white vinyl didn't want to stick, but I did eventually get it down. Do y'all ever have this problem, or is it just me? Let me know in the comments. These are the sayings that I decided to use, but you can use any sayings that you like. To finish it off, I used this red ribbon, wrapped it around the books, and hot glued it to the bottom of the book stack. I think this little candy cane book stack turned out so amazing. Let me know what you think in the comments. I got this large picture frame at Goodwill, and as y'all are well aware, I love thrift flips. I love taking something and transforming it. To start, I removed everything from the back. After removing the paper from the back, I realized the picture was held with staples. I used a pair of pliers and eventually got all the staples removed and was able to remove the picture. I placed the back of the frame onto a piece of foam board and cut it with a rotary tool. I used Waverly Crimson chalk paint and painted one side of the foam board, and of course dried it with my heat gun. I wanted to give the foam board a worn and weathered wood look. So I dry brushed Waverly Antiquing Wax and again dried it with my heat gun. I'll be using a chalk couture transfer. Since I will be placing the transfer onto a paper backing, I used a Dollar Tree natural sponge and rubbed some chalk couture surface wax onto the painted foam board and buffed it out. I placed the new transfer onto the fuzzing mat 4 or 5 times before placing it onto the foam board. This helps to remove some of the stickiness from the transfer, and I was hoping it wouldn't pull up the paper foam board covering. I placed the transfer onto the foam board and used a ruler to center it. Once it was centered, I used my hands, a roller, and also a squeegee to rub the transfer down and to make sure I didn't have any air bubbles in it. I used chalk couture bright white paste and applied a thick layer with a small squeegee. After the transfer was covered, I removed the excess paste and placed it back into the jar. At this point, I had my fingers and toes both crossed, hoping this would work out like I wanted. I pulled the transfer up and could not believe how amazing this sign turned out. Just look at how perfect it is. I cleaned the glass, placed the foam board in the frame, and replaced the back. Since the backing had been stapled, I used painter's tape and taped the back on. Next time I go to Home Depot, I'm going to pick up some of the little tabs and use those on this frame. The back may not be pretty, but it worked. Let me know what you think of this candy cane sign in the comments below. If you're interested in purchasing this item, you can find it in my online store. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Merry Christmas! I used a small Dollar Tree Christmas ball to create a tier tray Christmas ball. I removed the hanger from the top of the ball and set it to the side. I placed the ball on my Cricut weeder so I didn't have to touch it while working, or so I thought. I painted the ball with Mod Podge. I did this because for whatever reason, when I try to paint these balls, the paint just doesn't want to stick. Originally, I painted the ball red, but then decided to go with black. I think the black turned out smoother looking, and I like it a lot more. I cut out the word cheer using my Cricut and applied it to the Christmas ball. And then applied a layer of satin Mod Podge to protect it and give it just a little bit of shine. Since I always have trouble getting round things to sit right on my tier trays, so I decided to hot glue a little wood flower cutout to the bottom of the ball. And I painted it black to match. I think this little ball is so stinking cute. I got this little sled recently at a yard sale for $5. It's cute and all, but of course, I have something else in mind. The first thing I did was take the sled outside and use my Dremel tool to cut through the metal to remove the seat and the top of the sled. With everything removed, I used a couple of scrap pieces of wood and measured how wide I needed them to be. I cut the wood down using a miter saw. I had these red boards that I got out of a neighbor's trash and thought they were perfect for this sled. I did ask before I took them. I attached the boards using Dollar Tree wood glue and some screws. I drilled pilot holes first to keep the wood from splitting, or so I thought. I actually put one of the screws in too tight and split the wood. I attached the wood that I cut to the boards. I had cut the wood so that it would fit over the metal part of the sled to hold everything together. Once I had everything together, I started painting the rails of the sled. I wish I would have done this before putting the sled together, but I was so excited to see how this turned out, I wasn't thinking. I painted all the metal and the two pieces of wood I had cut with Waverly ink chalk paint. I like the distressed look of the boards, but I decided to paint the top of the sled with Waverly Crimson chalk paint. I applied Chalk Couture surface wax to the top of the sled and buffed it out. After fuzzing my Chalk Couture transfer, I placed it onto the sled. I used Chalk Couture bright white paste and applied it to the transfer. After the entire transfer was covered, I removed the excess and placed it back into the jar. I removed the transfer and wow, just look at how stinking cute this gnome turned out. I used some ribbon I got from Hobby Lobby and made a bow using a zip tie. And hot glued it onto the sled. And just look at how stinking cute. If you're interested in this item, you'll find it on. If you're interested in this item, you can find it in my online store. I'll leave a link in the description for it. I cut up some fabric I had in my stash to cover some Dollar Tree round Christmas balls. I wanted the ornaments to have a rustic country feel. I used a rotary cutter to cut the fabric on a Dollar Tree cutting mat. You don't have to use fabric scraps for this project. I also have a few old flannel shirts that I'll be using. After cutting the fabric, I removed the top from the plastic ornament and started hot gluing the strips of fabric onto the ball. I glued 4 strips down opposite of each other and then filled in the rest of the ball. Once the ball was completely covered, I replaced the top on the ball. And just look at how stinking cute this simple and easy DIY is. And it makes such a huge impact. Let me know in the comments what you think of these fabric covered Christmas balls. I found these little square wood signs at Hobby Lobby. I love using these to make tiara tray signs. The first thing I did was tape off the inside of the sign with painter's tape and stain the frame with Waverly antiquing wax. I then taped off the frame with painter's tape and painted the inside of the frame with Folk Art Imperial Red chalk paint. Once the paint was dry, I removed the tape. I found this cut file on Design Bundles, sized it down in Design Space, and applied it to the center of the frame. You'll find a link to Design Bundles in the description. They have some great cut files at really inexpensive prices, so be sure to check them out. And just look at how stinking cute this little tiara tray wood sign is. Let me know what you think in the comments. I used one of these little houses I picked up this summer and decided to make it into a gingerbread house. I painted the entire house with folk art Java chalk paint, and it did take 2 coats to cover the print underneath. Once the paint was dry, I used some fabric puff paint to decorate the front of the little house. I didn't really follow any design, just made it the way I wanted it. I tried to spell out candy in the center, but everything ran together. So now I wish I wouldn't have. But that's okay. I still think it's so stinking cute. I mixed some Dollar Tree spackling with some Waverly white chalk paint. I did this because the spackling actually has a little bit of a gray tone and I wanted it to be completely white. I used a craft stick to apply the spackling mixture to the roof of the gingerbread house. And I let it dry until everything was set up. I think this little house turned out so stinking cute, and it was so simple to make. I may actually have to make a few more. I picked up this wood puzzle at Target's Bullseye Spot for $3. When I saw it, the first thing I thought of was a gingerbread man. After taking a couple of the men out, I painted them with folk art Java chalk paint first. I then decided I wanted them to be lighter. So I went back over the Java paint with folk art territorial beige. The color was perfect for gingerbread men, I think. After the paint was dry, I used some black fabric puff paint to create the face and buttons on the gingerbread men. And then used white puff paint around the edges and on the hands and feet. And I think they look good enough to eat. Let me know what you think in the comments. I love doing flips, and I picked up 15 of these old windows at a yard sale this summer. I've only used a couple of them because I have to wait until inspiration hits me. Are you like that? Let me know in the comments. Well, inspiration hit me the other day. I received some adorable chalk couture transfers that would fit perfectly on this window. Since the window was large, I decided to work on it on the floor in my living room. And yeah, I got stuff everywhere and had to vacuum when I was done. The first thing I did was remove all the old glazing from the window. The glazing was already loose, so all I had to do was slide a razor blade between the glazing and the frame to remove it. After removing all the glazing, I went around the glass and frame with hot glue to hold the glass in the frame. I didn't want it falling out, of course. I cleaned the window with rubbing alcohol before adding the transfers. I tried to get off as much of the grease and grime as I could. I placed painter's tape across the centerpiece of wood on the frame because I didn't want the old paint to stick to the back of my transfers. This would ruin the transfer. I placed the transfers onto the glass, trying to space them out as evenly as I could. I applied a thick layer of candy apple red to the bottom portion of the first gnome. I used Storm for the second gnome. And I used black velvet on the body of the third gnome. I removed the excess paste from the transfers, placing the excess back into the corresponding jars. I didn't want the paste to dry on the transfers, so I removed each transfer at this point and washed them. Before removing the last gnome, I applied candy apple red paste to the hat. I let the transfers dry for a couple of hours before continuing. I used a damp Q-tip to clean up a few areas. I placed wax paper over the bottom of the window to protect the parts I had already stenciled. I lined up the hat with the first gnome and applied paste. I did the same thing with the other two hats. I used my heat gun to dry the gnomes' hats. Remove the wax paper and tape. And cleaned up any areas that needed it with a Q-tip. I filled in the gnomes with folk art chalk paint. I used a light brown acrylic paint for the gnomes' noses. I continued filling in the gnomes until I had them all covered. I love how this window flip turned out and can't wait to add it to the rest of my Christmas decor. I have fallen in love with chalk couture. You can do so much with it on so many different surfaces. If you want to learn more about chalk couture or just want to take a look at what they offer, you'll find a link in the description. And I have to say, this is one of the easiest DIYs I've ever done. I used some bells out of a pack I got from Walmart and some 20 gauge jewelry wire to make a cute little jingle bell wreath. I strung the bells onto the jewelry wire. And then made a circle, cut the wire, and twisted it to secure it. I placed a piece of twine around the top of the jingle bell wreath so it could be hung up on a Christmas tree. Now for the hard part. I had the hardest time trying to figure out what ribbon to use for the bow. After several attempts, I decided to go with red raffia. I tied the raffia into a bow and attached it to the jingle bell wreath. And just look at how stinking cute it turned out. I picked up this tray at a thrift store a while back. I've been holding on to it for Christmas. As you can see, the tray had a few bad spots from water damage, but I was determined to make this a Christmas tray. I cleaned the tray and removed some of the existing paint with a Dollar Tree sanding sponge, awesome cleaner, and nail polish remover. At first, I painted the inside of the tray with Waverly Crimson chalk paint. I found these natural wood candle holders in my stash. I think I got them from either Michael's or Hobby Lobby. I can't remember. I decided to use them as feet on the tray. I used Dollar Tree wood glue and hot glue to attach the little candle holders. I used the wood glue for a permanent hold and the hot glue for the immediate hold. At this point, I thought of a transfer I got from Chalk Couture and knew I had to repaint the tray with Waverly Mineral Chalk Paint. Do you do that? You have an idea when you start a project and then all of a sudden change your mind? Let me know in the comments if you do this too. I find myself doing it all the time. I painted the entire tray with mineral chalk paint, including the feet. I wanted to add a little distressing. I used a piece of sandpaper and just hit the areas that would show normal wear, the handles and the edges, and then cleaned it with a baby wipe. I then used Waverly Elephant Chalk Paint to give the tray a little more dimension and distressing. Once the tray was completely dry, I applied Chalk Couture surface wax to the inside of the tray. If you use these reusable mesh transfers on wood, I suggest using a surface wax to prolong the life of your transfer. I applied a thin layer of wax using a paper towel and then buffed it out. You don't want a thick layer of wax, just something between your wood and the transfer. I placed the Chalk Couture Joy to the World transfer on the fuzzing cloth 4 or 5 times, since this is the first time I'll be using this transfer. This is a large transfer. It's 18 inches by 18 inches. And I knew I only needed to use the top portion of it on the tray. So I only fuzzed the portion that I was going to use. I placed the transfer onto the tray and used a squeegee to make sure I didn't have any air bubbles. I'm sorry about my head, but when you get into a project, you sometimes forget about the camera. I added painter's tape to the areas I didn't want to get chalk paste onto. I placed Chalk Couture Black Velvet chalk paste onto the transfer. I used thick globs to start with, and then covered the entire transfer using a squeegee. Once the transfer was covered with paste, I began removing the excess and placing it back into the jar. Believe it or not, but a jar of Chalk Couture paste goes a long way. You want to start with a thick coat, but then you remove the excess paste and put it back into the jar. I've been using Chalk Couture for a couple of months now, and I love it. I'll leave a link to my Chalk Couture site in the description if you're wondering what it's all about and why you want to start using it. If you have any questions about Chalk Couture, leave me a comment below. I answer all my comments and love helping people when I can. I pulled the transfer up and knew right away I had made the right decision to repaint it. I have to admit, I messed up with the transfer. When I pulled it back, it actually stuck together in a few places. I was able to fix the transfer while I was cleaning it. When the transfer gets wet, it's not as sticky. So I was able to work with it and unstick it without ruining the transfer. I love the look of this tray, and it has one of my favorite Christmas song lyrics on it. The last thing I did was add a layer of satin Mod Podge to protect it. I have to say, I have a new Christmas favorite. I love everything about this little tray. Let me know in the comments what you think of this Joy to the World Christmas tray. I tried to remove the well from this sign I found in my stash, but decided to just use the back of the sign. I painted the sign with Folk Art Imperial Red and dried it with my heat gun. I then distressed it using a fan brush and Waverly Mineral Chalk Paint. I picked up these little metal letters and snowflake ornament at Hobby Lobby to make a joy sign. I applied hot glue to the back of the snowflake and attached it to the center of the sign. Because the metal letters were hollow, I glued a couple of tumbling tower blocks to the inside of the letters and then glued them to the sign. Stacking the two blocks on top of each other worked great, and the letters actually sat flat on the sign. I thought it was just plain and actually didn't like it much at this stage. I decided to use the sign as the middle of a wreath. I had some Dollar Tree garland in my stash from last year in this wreath form. I used floral wire to attach the garland to the wreath. I also attached the sign with floral wire. When I had all the garland wrapped and the sign attached, I added a bunch of hot glue to the back of the sign and pressed it into the wreath form. I made a little bow and glued it to the top of the wreath. And just look at how stinking cute it is. I found this 11 by 14 inch picture frame in my stash and knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. I had seen this Christmas decor piece at Pottery Barn and loved it, so I decided to dupe it with this picture frame. After taking the glass out of the frame and cleaning it with rubbing alcohol, I took it outside to create the mercury glass effect. This is the best way to create a faux mercury glass effect using water, vinegar, and Krylon looking glass spray paint. You'll need equal amounts of water and vinegar to achieve the mercury glass look. I used a half a cup of water to a half a cup of vinegar. I poured them both into a spray bottle and shook it well. I started with a light coat of Krylon mirrored glass spray paint on the glass. I then sprayed the water and vinegar mixture on the glass. And another layer of the paint. And more of the water and vinegar. Another layer of paint. Next, I used a towel and dabbed at the water. By dabbing at it, I was able to create cracked lines like you would see in a mercury glass mirror. I am really loving this. Another layer of paint. This layer is thicker than the layers I sprayed first. And I continued painting and dabbing until I was happy with the look. I let the paint dry for about 20 minutes and then added a layer of black spray paint. I lightly sanded the frame. I mix water and red acrylic paint to create a red stain and applied the red stain to the frame. I used my Cricut to cut out the saying and applied it using transfer paper. I'll leave a link in the description to the Design Space cut file that I created. I placed the glass and the backing back into the frame. I am just amazed at how this turned out. I love it so much. Let me know in the comments if you'll be trying this mercury glass sign. I used several of these mini wood rounds from Dollar Tree to make mini wood round Christmas ornaments. All of these turned out so stinking cute. You will be making them too. I painted the first round with Waverly Steel chalk paint and dried it with my heat gun. I applied and buffed chalk couture surface wax onto the round. I cut down this chalk couture transfer so it was more manageable for smaller projects. I applied the transfer and then applied a layer of bright white paste. I removed the excess and then lifted the transfer off. I used this Merry Christmas transfer and chalked the words Merry Christmas towards the bottom of the wood round. I applied a layer of Mod Podge to protect and seal the ornament. I strung a piece of twine through the hole. And I created a small bow with some Hobby Lobby ribbon and applied some small berries and the bow to the mini wood round. I love how the buffalo plaid turned out on this mini wood round ornament, and the striped bow was the perfect touch. For the second wood round, I applied a piece of painter's tape across the center of the round. I painted the top half of the round with Waverly antiquing wax. After the wax was dry, I applied another piece of tape over the stained portion of the round and painted the bottom of the round with Folk Art Imperial Red chalk paint. I used my Cricut, cut out the wording, and applied it to the wood round. I used some buffalo check wired ribbon and twine to create a small bow and hot glued it to the top of the mini wood round. And just look at how stinking cute it turned out. It'll look perfect on a Christmas tree. For the third ornament, I painted the entire wood round with folk art imperial red chalk paint. And dried it with my heat gun. I applied a layer of surface wax and used this reusable mesh transfer I got from Amazon. I really need to order another one of these. I have used this one so much, it really doesn't have that much stick any longer. I applied Chalk Couture Black Velvet to the transfer, removed the excess, and then removed the transfer. I cut out the phrase Merry Christmas Y'all with my Cricut and applied it to the wood round. And this was a little tricky because the vinyl didn't want to stick. I think that was because of the wax I had used, but I did eventually get it on there. I applied a layer of Mod Podge and a few embellishments to the top. And just look at how stinking cute it turned out. For the fourth ornament, I painted the entire round with Waverly Elephant chalk paint and dried it with my heat gun. Using my Cricut again, I cut out the phrase Let It Snow and applied it to the wood round. I then used a little Chalk Couture Snowflake transfer. I first applied bright white chalk paste and then went over it with shimmer frost paste to give it a little shimmer. To finish it off, I made a little messy bow and hot glued it to the top. I think this is my favorite mini wood round ornament, but it's really hard to decide. For the fifth ornament, I painted the entire round with Waverly White chalk paint and dried it with my heat gun. I placed a piece of painter's tape about 1/3 of the way down and painted the bottom portion with folk art imperial red chalk paint. I removed the tape and repositioned it onto the red portion of the round. I added another piece of tape, leaving about 1/4 of an inch of the white showing. I painted the stripe with Waverly ink chalk paint. I removed the tape and had a little gap, so I just free-handed the gap with the Waverly ink. I used my Cricut to cut out ho 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 and applied the vinyl to the wood round. I also used my Cricut to cut out a small belt buckle and applied it. After applying a layer of Mod Podge to protect and seal the ornament, I strung a piece of twine through the hole and tied a simple bow and hot glued it to the ornament. And just look at how sweet this little mini wood round Christmas ornament turned out. All of these ornaments turned out so stinking cute, I can't decide which one I like the best. Let me know in the comments which one of these ornaments you like the best. I had these Dollar Tree party hats in my stash and thought they would make great mini Christmas trees. I used some Yarn Bee chunky yarn from Hobby Lobby on the first tree. I started at the top of the tree. I applied hot glue and started wrapping the chunky yarn around the party hat. I continued wrapping until I got to the bottom of the tree. For the second tree, I used a different yarn from Hobby Lobby. This yarn is more like a thin fur. I did the same process as I did on the first tree. Starting at the top, I added hot glue and began wrapping the hat with the furry yarn. It took longer to wrap this tree because the yarn was thinner, but it was well worth the time. For the third tree, I used this bandana from Hobby Lobby. I placed the party hat on top of the fabric and traced around it using a black Sharpie. I cut out the cone shape into two pieces of the bandana. The bandana is pretty thin, so that's why I used two pieces, so you wouldn't be able to see the color of the party hat underneath. I used a glue stick to attach the two pieces of fabric together. I then used hot glue to attach the fabric to the party hat. After I had the trees finished, I decided to add tree trunks. I turned the trees upside down and put a bunch of hot glue at the tip of the hat. Then I stuck a dowel into the hot glue and held it straight until the hot glue had time to set up. I put more hot glue to make sure it was secure. For the base of the trees, I used these wood slices I have in my stash and hot glued the dowel to the wood slice. I held the tree until the hot glue had time to set up. I had a couple of these rusty stars in my stash, so I glued them together and placed them on top of the first tree. On the second tree, I used this snowflake ornament I got from Hobby Lobby. I think these little Christmas trees turned out so stinking cute, and they were easy to make using these party hats. Let me know in the comments if you'll be trying to make these little Christmas trees. I would love to see how yours turn out. I used a Dollar Tree glove to make a few adorable pine cone gnome Christmas ornaments. For the first pine cone, I cut off the pinky of the glove since I was using a small pine cone. I placed a dab of glue at the top of the pine cone and placed a small piece of twine in the glue. I cut a small hole at the top of the hat for the twine to fit through and pulled the hat down over the top of the pine cone. I placed another dab of hot glue in the hole with the twine and gently pushed the hole closed. I placed another dab of hot glue and placed a small wood bead for the nose. And just like that, I have this adorable little gnome pine cone ornament. For the next gnome, I basically did the same thing as the first. Cut a finger off the glove, cut a small hole in the top of the hat, attach the twine to the pine cone, place the hat on the gnome, and attach the nose. I added a small piece of this furry yarn to create a beard for this gnome. And I closed the hole at the top of the hat with hot glue. I used a longer pine cone for this gnome and added a little white paint to give it a snowy effect. I glued a piece of the twine for the hanger. I cut another finger of the glove and snapped a small hole at the top for the twine. Placed the hat on the pine cone and closed off the hole with more hot glue. I placed a dab of hot glue and a wood bead for this nose. And another gnome pine cone ornament is adorable and complete. I used an even larger pine cone and painted it with white paint for a snowy effect. And let me tell you, I really covered this one with the paint. Since this pine cone was so large, I cut the rest of the fingers off the glove and used the middle of the glove for the hat. I pulled on the glove a little and placed it over the top of the pine cone. I ran a bead of hot glue down the back side of the hat and placed the twine in the glue and bunched the hat around the glue. I tied the top of the hat with another piece of twine to close up the hole at the top. I trimmed some of the fabric from the top of the hat and tied this little pom-pom I had made for another project around the top of the hat and trimmed the ends of the yarn. I hot glued a red wood bead to the pine cone for the nose. And added some of the furry yarn around the bottom of the hat. Pinecone gnome number 4 is now in the books. I used a piece of braided yarn from my stash as the girl gnome's hair. Placed another glove finger on top for the hat. Added a piece of twine and a bead for the nose. I also trimmed the ends of her braids. She is so cute. And here are all 5 pine gnome ornaments. I think they all turned out so stinking cute. I can't decide which is my favorite. I love them all. Let me know which is your favorite in the comments. I used red, white, and stain beads to make a garland for a gingerbread tier tray. I strung the beads onto a white cotton string until I was happy with the length. I then tied a cute little chalkboard tag at one end. I was going to make a tassel for the other end, but then decided to attach this little piece of Christmas greenery on it. I found this Dollar Tree candy cane wood cutout sticker in my stash and thought it would be so stinking cute on the chalkboard part of the garland. I painted the candy cane with Waverly white chalk paint and used a paint pen from Walmart for the red parts of the candy cane. I painted the bow with folk art gold metallic paint to finish it off. I then removed the paper from the sticker on the back and attached it to the center of the chalkboard tag. And just look at how stinking cute. This garland is so adorable. I found this little gnome pattern online at Ruffles and Rainbows. I'll leave a link in the description to the pattern if you're interested. I printed the pattern out and then cut it out. I pinned all the body pieces to some red felt to make a Santa gnome. I then cut all the pieces out. I found this fur ribbon at Hobby Lobby and had to have it for my gnomes. I pinned the beard portion of the pattern to the fuzzy ribbon and cut it out. I started by gluing the body of the gnome together. I then rolled the arms up and glued them. This was a little tricky, and I did burn my fingers with hot glue a couple of times. But I wanted my gnome to have arms. Next, I glued the hat together. I then turned the body right side out. I placed a handful of stuffing into the top of the body and then added some Dollar Tree beans at the bottom. I used the beans to give the gnome some weight so it wouldn't just flop over. I folded the bottom of the gnome down and hot glued it. I cut another piece of felt and glued it to the bottom just to make sure it was held and the beans wouldn't fall out. I turned the hat right side out. I used a bead of hot glue on the back of the furry ribbon, attached it to the gnome body, and applied more hot glue under the beard. I used some Dollar Tree Chanel yarn, wrapped it around two of my fingers about 20 or 25 times, placed another piece of the yarn through the center, and tied a knot. This will be the pom-pom at the top of the hat. After trimming and shaping the pom-pom, I hot glued it to the top of the hat at the little point. I glued one end of the arm together, stuffed the arm with a little stuffing, and glued the arm to the gnome body. And guys, I'm sorry, but this is where the battery went dead and I didn't know it. But to finish this cute little Santa gnome off, I did the same thing with the other arm. I glued some Dollar Tree black yarn onto the ends of the arms as hands, and then glued a little Christmas tree to the hands. I also used a 12mm natural wood bead for the nose. I thought the hat needed a little something else, so I glued some of the white yarn that I had used for the pom-pom around the edge of the hat. And I think this little Santa gnome turned out so stinking cute. And I will definitely be using this pattern more. Let me know in the comments what you think of this little Santa. And again, I'm sorry about the battery running dead and not realizing it. I applied some glue to some little Christmas trees I found in my stash and attached scrapbook paper to both sides of the trees. I used a finger sander and sanded the paper in a downward motion. This gave the trees a rustic look, and the paper tore along the edge of the trees. I used a nail file to get into the tight spots that the finger sander didn't reach. After I finished removing the excess paper from the trees, I used dowels and cut them down to various lengths. I used a drill bit the size of the dowel and drilled holes into the bottom of the trees. I dipped one end of the dowel into some hot glue and then attached it to the bottom of the trees. I dipped the other end of the dowel into the hot glue and attached it to a wood slice. And when I was finished, I had some cute little Christmas trees for my Christmas decorating. And it really did not take long at all. I think the little Christmas trees are so stinking cute and will be perfect for a little touch of Christmas in any room of the house. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I have a ton of scrap wood, so I decided to use a few pieces to make some little mini tier tray wood Christmas trees. I used my miter saw and cut the pieces at a 45-degree angle and sanded them. I painted one of the trees with Waverly white chalk paint. I applied a layer of chalk couture surface wax to the front of the tree and buffed it out. I used this chalk couture tree transfer and placed it on the fuzzing cloth 4 to 5 times to make the transfer less sticky. I applied the top portion of the transfer to the little wooden tree and rubbed it down with a roller. I applied a thick layer of chalk couture ink to the transfer and then removed the excess and placed it back into the jar. I removed the transfer and set it with my heat gun. And just look at how stinking cute. For the next tree, I painted it with Waverly moss chalk paint. I used twine and wrapped it around the tree several times. For the last tree, I painted it with folk art bright green paint. I used some Dollar Tree wired twine and wrapped it around the tree. And just look at how stinking cute these 3 little scrap wood trees are. And they didn't cost me anything. I had all the items in my stash. I found this little sleigh at Dollar Tree and wanted to change it up a little. After removing the tag and florals attached to it, I painted it with Waverly ink chalk paint. This will be my base coat. I then created a faux galvanized metal look by using folk art pearl white and gunmetal gray metallic paint and brushed black brushed metal paint. I used a Dollar Tree makeup sponge and a clothespin to apply the paint. I dipped the makeup sponge into the paint and dabbed it onto the sleigh. I continued doing this until I was happy with the way the sleigh looked. To finish the sleigh, I placed various pieces of Dollar Tree Christmas picks inside of the sleigh. I didn't glue them, so if I decide to put something else in it, I can. I think the little sleigh is so cute and looks amazing on this tiara tray from Target. Let me know in the comments what you think. I used 4 20mm wood beads from my Amazon store, a silver jingle bell from Dollar Tree, and some jute twine. I placed the twine through the top of the jingle bell and pulled both ends of the twine together. I placed a piece of painter's tape on the twine so it would be easier to thread through the wood beads. I placed the 4 wood beads on the twine with the jingle bell. I left the beads the natural color, but you can paint them to match your Christmas decor. I removed the tape and tied a small knot at the top of the twine and trimmed it. And look at how cute this simple ornament is. For the next wood bead ornament, I painted a 20mm wood bead with folk art metallic gold paint. I placed another piece of tape on the end of a piece of jute twine and started stringing the beads. The pattern I used was 2 16mm beads, 1 18mm bead, the gold bead, another 18mm bead, and finally 2 more 16mm beads. I tied a small knot at the top of the ornament, leaving some twine so it could be hung. And it's so simple and cute. I found this little rusted snowflake in my stash and wanted to attach it to one of the beaded ornaments. Again, I used a piece of jute twine and wrapped tape around the end. I tied a small knot at the top and began stringing the beads onto the jute just like I did before. I used the same size beads as in the previous DIY and the same pattern. I then strung the rusty little star at the bottom and tied another small knot. This ornament looks so rustic. I think it's my favorite so far. I have several of these wood slices in my stash. I painted the first one with folk art imperial chalk paint. I didn't paint it entirely. I left a small area around the raw edge. I also painted one of the wood beads red to match the ornament. I used 3 of these little wood Christmas tree stickers I found in my stash. I think I got them last year at Dollar Tree, but I'm not positive. But I used them to decorate the front of the ornament. I simply took the paper off of the sticker on the back and stuck it to the wood. I strung a piece of jute twine through the hole at the top and then added a natural wood bead and the red painted bead to the twine and tied a knot. I painted this wood slice with Waverly Steel chalk paint. just like I did in the previous one. And again painted one of the beads to match. I used this bell from this Chalk Couture transfer and some bright white paste on the front. Before removing the transfer, I also applied a layer of shimmer frost just to give it a little bit of a shimmer. I added a piece of twine, 2 natural beads, and the steel bead I had painted to the top of the ornament. I created a small bow using this gray and white buffalo plaid ribbon and hot glued it to the front of the wood slice. And just look at how adorable these 2 wood slice ornaments are. I found these wood ornaments on Amazon, but I think Dollar Tree carries them also. I just didn't find them at my local Dollar Tree. I painted 5 of the ornaments with Waverly white chalk paint. And then painted the other 5 with Waverly ink chalk paint. I used a buffalo transfer I found on Amazon, and you'll find it in my Amazon store. The link's in the description. You don't have to use the Chalk Couture paste with these transfers. You can use them like you would any other stencil. On the white ornaments, I applied a thick layer of Chalk Couture black velvet chalk paste and removed the excess, placing it back into the jar. On the black ornaments, I used a thick layer of Chalk Couture Candy Apple Red. I then removed the transfer from the ornaments. At first, I was going to leave them just like this with the buffalo plaid, but I decided I wanted to add a little something more. I decided to use these Chalk Couture Christmas minis. You'll also find a link to my Chalk Couture site in the description. They look like they would fit perfect. I cut all the different transfers, following the line in the middle of them. With each transfer, I placed it on the fuzzing cloth to remove some of the stickiness. I didn't want the transfers to pull up the buffalo print I had just created and dried. I positioned the transfer onto the ornament and pressed it down, removing any air bubbles. For the red and black ornaments, I used Chalk Couture bright white paste. I apply the paste to the transfer, remove the excess, and then remove the transfer. I absolutely love the way this one turned out with Noel on it. I continue chalking all the red and black ornaments first. With the black and white ornaments, I used Chalk Couture Candy Apple Red with the transfers. I think the white paste on the red and black ornaments turned out so stinking cute. I'm not too sure for the red on the black and white though. Let me know what you think in the comments. I may have to redo the black and white ones, but they all turned out really stinking cute. I found a couple of these wood eggs at Hobby Lobby. When I saw them, the first thing I thought of was a gnome. I applied Waverly antiquing wax to the wooden egg and wiped it with a paper towel. I used this faux fur ribbon, also from Hobby Lobby, for the gnome's beard. I cut it to size and then shaped it into the beard. And let me tell you, this faux fur sheds when you cut it, but it's well worth it. I applied the beard using hot glue. I got this sweater from Goodwill, and I'd already cut it up. I found a section that would work for the gnome's hat and put it together with more hot glue. I placed the hat on his head and used a 12mm natural wood bead for his nose. I decided to give him some arms. I cut another section from the sweater, rolled it up, and applied hot glue down the seam. I wrapped the arms around his back and glued them into place. I wanted my little gnome to hold something. I had picked up these little Christmas trees, so I just hot glued one of them into his hands. I used some scrap wood to create an adorable book stack for a gingerbread themed tier tray. The blocks are approximately 4 inches by 3.5 inches. In my opinion, this is the perfect size for a tier tray book stack. I painted the books with folk art chalk paint. I used Imperial Red, White, and Java. But the color choices are up to you. I created and sized 3 phrases in Design Space and cut them out. I applied the first phrase, Candy Cane Lane, to the red book. I applied the next phrase, Gingerbread Way, to the Java book. I used white Oracle vinyl for both of these. And then the final phrase, Peppermint Avenue. You will find the Oracle vinyl that I use in my Amazon store in the description. You could leave them just like this or rearrange the sayings in another order. I'm not going to hot glue the books together just in case I want to change something or add other phrases to it. I used a piece of Dollar Tree baker's twine and wrapped it around the books a couple of times and tied a simple bow at the top. I absolutely love how this little tiara tray wood book stack turned out. Let me know what you think in the comments. Please take a second to like this video and leave me a comment. This really helps my channel to grow so others just like yourself can find me. If you just found me, I hope you will join our little family by hitting the subscribe button. If you are already part of the family, thank you so much for your love and support. Y'all are the absolute best. Check out my new Amazon store for craft supply and farmhouse home decor recommendations. All the products I use from Amazon in my videos can be found there. Until next time, happy crafting!